Ethiopia has since November last year seen a series of protests in two main regions, primarily the Amhara and Oromo region. And what we have seen are reports of a security clampdown that has led to the arrest of over 2,000 people and the alleged death of hundreds of protesters. Today, we saw earlier on in the day, the Ethiopian foreign minister, that is Tedros Ghebreyesus, who has officially responded to the Human Rights Watch over a series of reports about the situation in the country. The foreign minister accusing the Human Rights Watch of stoking anti-government protests through what it calls false and negative reporting on the situation in the country. And to try and understand exactly what is going on, we joined on the line from Montreal, Ethiopian writer and journalist Zacharias Zelalem. Good evening to you, Zacharias. So I suppose is it afternoon or morning for you in Montreal?
Well, it is afternoon here, but as you know, since our sole focus of news is from Africa, you can say mentally for us it's the evening as well.
It definitely is. Let's try and understand the situation, Zacharias. I mean, I have for a bit been following specifically what is happening around Oromia, but we're talking about two main regions where there have been protests in Ethiopia, in the Amhara and Oromia. Tell us about those two protests and what is at the core of the issue.
Okay, well, the core issue, there isn't really one core issue. It's two different issues for two different peoples, two different ethnic groups. Mm-hmm. And the Oromo protest movement started about almost a year ago now, while the Amhara protests are marking 6 months or so since their debut on the national justice-seeking scene. But in both cases, the government has refused the demands of negotiations and dialogues, and let alone implement any sort of national reform, and has decided to clamp down on them, on both movements, both unarmed protest movements, violently. And now we have death tolls, really tragic death tolls in the Oromia region. The Oromo protests death toll had reached about, I think it was 500 that Human Rights announced back in July, and it's been something around, I would say, about half of that for the Amhara region protests. So we have very different demands by two different ethnic groups, but unfortunately for both movements, they're both being treated the same as terror. Well, the government describes them as terrorist movements, and they're both being treated with a brutal crackdown.
Yeah, and to understand a bit more on the two separate issues, what is at the core of what the Amhara are raising and what the Oromo people are raising?
Okay, well, the Amhara protests were initially kicked off in response to the government's refusal to discuss the appropriation of the Walqait Tagari region, which is a strip of land between the Amhara and Tigrayan states. And 25 years ago, the land was encompassed as part of the state of Tigray, belonging to the ethnic Tigrayan people. There's a significant sector of the Amhara population who have until now remained resentful over this decision and feel that land actually belongs to them. They are the ancestral heirs to that land. Mm-hmm. So there was a committee. There was the Walqait Tagari Committee, council of elders and people from the region who decided to approach the government in, you can say, a reconciliatory tone, with the intention of discussing the matter much more closely. This was about 6-7 months ago, and the 15 or 20 members have since all been detained, which basically sent a clear which was basically the government sending a clear message that this topic is not up for discussion, and even considering bringing the subject back to the National Discussion Forum is a crime against the state. And then from there, everything degraded. It got into protests, and then it became what we have tragically seen over the past 6 months, the brutal militarization of the region. In Oromia, it's much different. It's a much different topic. The main grievance was the government's planning to implement the Addis Ababa master plan, which was the extension of the capital city of Addis Ababa into areas of Oromia that are primarily inhabited by poor Oromo farmers. The plan would have displaced most of these farmers and rendered them homeless, while their farming lands were turned into real estate territories for primarily the moguls who control the country. So that too was a contentious issue that could have been dealt with through dialogue and round the table discussions. But as we have seen over the past 11 months, the government would prefer to voice its concerns from the barrel of the gun rather than sit down and discuss with their own people. So this is where we're at in 2016.
We've seen specifically with the Oromo people, very disturbing. As you've mentioned, the protests have been going on for much longer than the Amhara people. What we have seen specifically in terms of the Oromo people, live ammunition being used by the government, hundreds of protesters that have been killed. And yet you see the reports where the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry is saying that the report by Human Rights Watch is, if anything, a misrepresentation of the facts, but also encouraging official or rather opposition violence in Ethiopia. Clearly, there's very differing views on exactly what is going on, and this position from government would be expected, I suppose.
Yes, it is expected. The statement by Minister Tedros Adhanom was not surprising in the least. Of course, they are going to deny the basics of any human rights report on the 11-month justice-seeking movements. But here's the thing: if Tedros Adhanom sincerely believes that all of these organizations based abroad reporting on the issue and that have come to conclusions that the government is at fault for the violence that has occurred, if the minister truly believes that these organizations have some sort of ill intent towards the state of the country and the government, then why doesn't he select who he believes are independent researchers, organizations with no clear bias, who will be able to do their own research and come to their own conclusions after having done their own findings without involvement of the government or any of the players that the government considers hostile to the state. If, as the minister alleges, there is nothing to hide and the government is clear of any wrongdoing, then this view should also be shared by any independent disaster relief association organizations who would commit their own time to looking for facts. But until now, the government refuses to allow anyone to enter the country. They'll just block visas to anyone who declares that journalist or human rights advocate who declares that they want to enter the country and come to their own conclusions for facts. Why doesn't the government open the door for us to find the truth on our own? It's as simple as that. The government has lost credibility in terms of what it releases in regards to human rights. If it literally has nothing to hide, it should open the country. It shouldn't close it up.
We're speaking to Zachariah Zelalem, who is an Ethiopian writer and journalist, speaking to us out of Montreal in Canada. Zachariah, one of the other very confusing matters or issues that one needs to look at is how this situation, and especially the situation of the Oromo people, how it relates to Eritrea, because we have seen previous reports of links between some of the core issues that have been raised. I mean, you mentioned the Tigrayan people, and we know that they are also in Eritrea itself. How do the issues link with bordering Eritrea?
Okay, well, in terms of Eritrea, as I'm sure you know yourself, between 1998 and 2000, Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a very, very bloody border war over the Bademe strip of land. And since then, since 2000, which is 16 years now, the two countries have remained at odds, at a sort of no peace, no war footing. And there's a traditional enmity between the two. The Ethiopian government supports Eritrean opposition elements and vice versa. So whenever any sort of inner dissent, stoking from both countries, erupts, whether it just be small incidents of violence or mass protest, both governments tend to blame the other. Eritrea tends to blame Ethiopia. Ethiopia will tend to blame Eritrea for sponsoring any sort of uprisings in their country. And there is, of course, truth to this. The Eritrean government, it has been founded by conclusions that many organizations have come to. The Eritrean government has indeed sponsored many separatist groups, Ethiopian separatist groups, in their struggles. But the fact of the matter is there are underlying burning social issues within the country that would exist, whether or not the Eritrean government plays a role. To say that all would have been calm and well had it not been for the intervention of hostile elements such as Eritrea and Egypt is just naivety. I mean, it's just if they were to actually think that people would fall for these lies, it'd be foolhardy, because they're just using Eritrea as a scapegoat to avoid addressing our social issues.
Yeah.
Ethiopia's social issues need to be dealt with, and you cannot pin them all on neighboring countries. It's as simple as that.
We have on the show, and we did even earlier on at the start of the show, been discussing and questioning the issue of accountability on the African continent. And what you have highlighted is a very disturbing state of affairs. And then there's been other reports around the repression by the Ethiopian government, it being described as a police state. It's linked to the U.S. as well. But it raises a lot of questions, Zacharias, around Ethiopia with Addis as the seat of the African Union, whether or not any African country would be in any position to call Ethiopia to order and address the allegations that have been leveled at the government itself. So the question then being, if there's not going to be, seemingly at least for now, any assistance that would come from or accountability being called for from African governments, how else does one deal with the situation?
Well, we are discussing this now some 5 years after. It's funny. It's just some 5 years after Muammar Gaddafi's government was overthrown by non-African elements, by European, Western elements, without the say of African powers whatsoever. The African states, their opinions weren't. Nobody in Africa was consulted with. So this does show that, in general, African leaders, members of the African Union, are pawns and have very little say, because most of the individual leaders are occupied consolidating their own powers, their own power bases back home, that they would probably give a lot less time and focus to the brewing resent in other countries across the continent. So, to be honest, I do not see anything from the African Union or from any of Africa's governing bodies, such as IGAD, for instance, in terms of these organizations playing a sort of peacemaker role in a country like Ethiopia, because there is no clarity, there is no common vision among these countries. It's just it's sad to say, but in 2016, most of our continental organizations have just become clubs of autocrats.
Yeah.
And among autocrats, they have their own houses to protect. So to ask for let's say neighboring countries like Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania or Rwanda to intervene, even in a peacemaker role in Ethiopia, they would feel like a lot of these countries would feel like they would be throwing stones from a glass house. That is how they would portray it.
Very difficult one there. And finally, Zacharias, I mean, on the same issue of how else can the situation be resolved, and again staying with the lack of accountability and lack of any form of weight on any of the African leaders to say anything to their counterparts. What we've seen in countries such as Zimbabwe, in the DRC, and we've seen also out in Burundi, where young people are beginning to rise up. Is there space at all for young people to take up these fights in Ethiopia, or is there a fear of repression as we have seen?
Well, whether the autocrats in power like it or not, the power is shifting towards the people, thanks to the weapons of the modern day era, that are social media and the spread of information. So this will, without a doubt, spark the downfall of many of the autocrats who have maintained their same tactics, their same bullish tactics of over the past 30 years, 40 years, to stifle any sort of dissent in their country and maintain the uniformity and prolong their dictatorships. They're not changing their stances throughout time. They're becoming out of date, and they're becoming just seen as they're being seen as illegitimate nationwide by the swaths of youth resistant movements in Africa, who are also inspired by a lot of their compatriots in the diaspora, in Europe, in North America, in exile elsewhere. What you see in Burundi, what you saw a couple of months ago in Gabon, what we're seeing in Ethiopia, these things will not be tamed, and people are as fearless as ever now. And this is the trend in Africa. So if anybody from the upper echelons of power in Ethiopia and in any of the countries that you mentioned yourself would have some common sense, it would be to stop with their current trends, to realize that their grip on power will eventually loosen, and they'd rather make their exits a lot more graceful and a lot more in tandem with the wishes of the people than something that would forever tarnish their reputations. And I hope we will see some African leaders rise to the occasion and decide to do something for the benefit of their own people for once.
I hope so too. Zacharias Zelalem, who is an Ethiopian writer and journalist, thank you very much.